Well, today we're going to talk about one of the most popular Buick Rivieras in the Riviera's storied history, and that is this 1982 Buick Riviera. Now, the Buick Riviera was all new for the 1979 model year, and for the first time, the Riviera was going to be front-wheel drive. Before this time frame, the Riviera was still based on the E-body platform that it shared with the Tornado and Eldorado. But now the Riviera would be on an EK platform that was shared with the Tornado, Eldorado, as well as the Cadillac Seville, and all of those vehicles would be front-wheel drive. So the Riviera no longer had its unique rear-wheel drive element, though it shared previously the same platform as the Tornado and Eldorado. Now, regardless of its underpinnings, this particular 1982 Buick Riviera is a beautiful 2,700-mile copy that is available right now and Bring a Trailer by Competition Cars. And it's just a gorgeous car. I think that it's finished in a color called light redwood. And it's just a gorgeous coppery color for this car. It's absolutely beautiful. And this 1982 Riviera is arguably the last one that really has some romance, I'll say, associated with it. I think the 1995 Riviera is also a good-looking vehicle, but it's not a romantic car per se. This one has some of that old-school charm, and I think that's what makes it so special. Is it's really the last of this kind of old-school styling that would end beginning in 1986, as 1986 would bring in the new ultra-downsized Riviera. Now, as we rotate around to this rear three-quarter view, you can see that the Riviera has this beautiful undulating belt line that kind of goes up and down and up and down. It's one of the few cars that does this, and I think it does it quite well. And it also has these beautiful sculpted wheel arches that are pretty fat at the top and then kind of taper as they go to the side of the wheel arch. I think it's just a wonderful detail. I do wish that this car was devoid of the vinyl roof and the body side molding. I think this car is extra beautiful without that have-to-pay vinyl roof that kind of takes away from the sharpness of the overall roof line and the backlight. And I think the car just loses some character as a result of that. And in point of fact, here's a 1979 model that does not have the vinyl roof. I just think that the roof overall looks more crisp and it helps the vehicle's looks overall to not have that vinyl roof. But, that's just my opinion. I think the car still looks good with the vinyl roof. And one of the things that the vinyl roof kind of takes away from is this beautiful, I would say, creased A-pillar and roof. Notice that kink in the A-pillar as well as the roof, or that crease. It's just a beautiful design element and was really inspired by General Motors design vice president Bill Mitchell and the Rolls Royces that he saw on a trip to England. He wanted these cars to have a very tight upper, this creased upper. And I think that it endows the vehicle with a great look, especially in a metallic paint like this, where you can see the light just breaks over that surface and gives it a great, let's say, look of dimension to it. I do also think it's interesting on these Rivieras, as well as the Eldorado, Sevilles, etc., that they have these 4 pieces of sheet metal mating up in a single area just beneath the windshield on either corner. The fenders, the hoods, the doors, and this separate panel all come together in one place. That had to be a very difficult to execute assembly to get all those gaps right and to get all the panels to fit right. Unless I'm mistaken. Somebody put a comment in the comment section if you think otherwise. But I have to imagine that had to be a very challenging thing to get to fit together. I don't know of many other cars that I can think of where you get 4 pieces of sheet metal that are intersecting in one place, likely for that reason. Now, before we continue on to the inside of the vehicle, burn those previous images into your mind and then take a look at this clay model that you see here. Looks very similar to the Riviera that you saw, the 1982 Riviera, but this was actually not a proposal for the 1979 Riviera that would evolve into the 79 to 85 Riviera. What you see here is actually a proposal for the 1977 Riviera that was rejected by Buick's general management. And, well, that's an interesting story, you say. This clearly looks very similar to the car that you just saw. It doesn't have that undulating belt line. It's got a drooping belt line and then a reverse D line. In other words, that daylight opening has this kind of reverse shape to it near the C-pillar and a very upright backlight. So not everything was reused from this clay model on that final Riviera that you just saw. But as I said, this model was rejected by Buick's general management for the 1977 Riviera because when this car was being developed, Buick had just gotten away from the boat tail Riviera. And the sales team wanted a car that was just more, I don't know what else to call it, I guess boring or vapid than the boat tail. They just wanted a boring Riviera. They were tired of something that was controversial. And this car perhaps had too many controversial styling elements. So it was rejected. And then Buick came out with that aborted-looking 1977-78 Riviera that only lasted 2 years, kind of a warmed-over LeSabre that almost everyone forgets, before coming out with the beautiful 79 Riviera that I think was really inspired by this particular clay model. And here's a sketch by Alan Flowers of something that probably inspired the clay model that you just saw. You can see this has that drooping belt line and reverse D line and a lot of the same features that you saw in the clay model. Large rocker moldings, of course, you got to have those on your luxury car. But again, this was a rejected car and I guess for whatever reason was perceived to be too controversial from a styling standpoint, so much so that the Buick general management just didn't want it. And here we have a scale model that shows some evolution from the previous sketches in the clay model that you saw. I would guess that this was a scale model that was done for the 1979 Riviera, not the 77 or 78. And you can see it has some elements of the previous car, but also some different ones. That reverse D line is now gone. The drooping belt line is still there to some degree, but toned down a bit. And the deck lid is more sloping, let's say, in profile than the other car. And of course, there's these very strong wheel arches, as well as the front fender's got an interesting feature line on it. So a little bit different from the final car, and the backlight is very small on this. That deck lid is pulled up very high, so the backlight is quite small. But these were some of the thoughts that I believe generated what you saw and what came to fruition on the 79 to 85 Riviera. And I should also mention that 1982 represented the first convertible year for the Riviera. There was not a convertible previous to this. In fact, General Motors was not really producing convertibles to this point after they had sunset convertibles following the 1976 model year. And it was thought at the time that there were going to be rollover standards in place that would preclude the sale of convertibles. Those really never came to pass, and eventually General Motors reintroduced them, and the Riviera got, I think, a good-looking convertible that you see here for 1982. Now, as we flip to the inside of the vehicle, you'll notice that there are the so-called acres of plastic wood here on the dash, on the door panels, on the steering wheel that's inset there, and the rim. And there are speakers actually in the door panels. You can see the speaker grills that are in front of the door handle. Now notice this car does have a center console. It's a pretty wimpy center console, very small overall, not a full width center console, full length center console, I should have said. But you can't see it in this photo. One good thing that Buick did add for these cars with the center console that was different from some older Rivieras was that there was an armrest. You actually got an armrest with the center console as opposed to some of the older Rivieras where you did not get the armrest in the event you opted for the center console. You'll also notice because this is a front-wheel drive car, it has a perfectly flat floor up front, which is great for passenger compartment space. Of course, there's no room for the middle seat passenger here in this particular Riviera because there's no place for that person to sit, and that would have been one of the benefits of the flat floor, but oh well. You also got that one-piece floor mat, which was good and bad. It was attractive, but it was hard to kind of get out in the event you wanted to clean it or clean underneath it, and I think for that reason it would end up going away in future years. And as we pan back a little bit, you can see the front seat of these Rivieras was pretty spacious. The back seat wasn't bad. Actually had about the same, if not even in some cases, a little bit more room than the previous generation Riviera. The packaging on those previous generation cars just wasn't all that great. Here, the seat stitch pattern is also interesting. It's this kind of ribbed design that, well, I guess it's just an interesting thing to look at. Now, when the Riviera was introduced for the 1979 model year, it came standard with Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch gasoline-powered V8 that made 160 horsepower. And in the T-types and as optional equipment, you could get Buick's 3.8-liter turbocharged V6 that made, well, really not that much more horsepower. more specifically made 170 horsepower with all the turbo lag of a 70s era V6 engine. So I don't know that that was a great trade-off, even if you got the T-type Riviera. But still, you had 160 or 170 horsepower. Unfortunately, by the time 1982 rolled around, well, the standard and optional engines just looked a little bit different. The standard engine now was Buick's 4.1-liter V6. This was basically the 3.8-liter V6 that was enlarged to 4.1 liters, came with a 4-barrel carburetor, made, I believe, 125 horsepower. Optional was the engine that you see here, Oldsmobile's 5-liter 307 cubic inch V8 that made 140 horsepower. Then you could get the 3.8-liter turbo V6, and you could get even a 5.7-liter diesel in your 1982 Buick Riviera. So the powertrains weren't as nice as the 1979 and 1980 model years. Those are the years that still have the good, let's say, Oldsmobile 350 gas engine. If you're really wanting to seek out one of these with decent performance, that's what I would recommend. I'd probably stay away from the turbocharged engines. These turbochargers, unlike today's turbochargers, weren't all that durable. If you find a low mileage car, it's probably okay, but yeah, you're best to get the bulletproof Olds 350 under hood. That's not to say that these Olds 307s were bad engines. They just didn't have the torque that the 350 had. And you can see there's a lot of vacuum lines running all over the place, so they're considerably bogged down. The 307 was a good engine that lasted for a long period of time, but it just didn't have the oomph that the 350 had. You'll notice here that this car has the GM radial style air conditioning compressor, the pancake compressor by this point. The A6 compressor was gone. And these compressors are okay. Like I said on other videos, they tended to leak from the seals, so they're not as good as the A6 compressors. And overall, just not a bad powertrain, I would say. Turbohydromatic 325 transmission, not as good as the previous 425. Of course, it's doing lighter duty in a much smaller car than the previous generation Riviera. And the previous generation Rivieras were also rear-wheel drive, so they used kind of the standard turbohydromatic 400 transmission as an example that were just absolutely bulletproof. So some of the things here were a bit, not quite as good as previous Rivieras of the past, but still relatively good overall. And a little bit of obscure trivia, you could see that by this point, General Motors had gone to the electric compressor for the rear air shocks. That's what's in the kind of front left area of this picture. And the front right is the cruise control transducer. And these cruise control transducers sometimes have a tendency to seize after all these years. So if your speedometer needle is jiggling around and you have one of these cruise control style transducers, you might end up needing to replace it before you break your speedometer cable. Just something to be aware of. I have had that happen to me, and I just thought I would warn you of that in case you experience those circumstances. So what's your opinion of this particular Riviera, this generation, the 79 to 85? I think it's still quite a handsome car. I actually think the next generation, the 86 Riviera, is a good-looking car too, but it just was not a continuation of this vehicle. I just can't imagine somebody who drove one of these larger 79 to 85 Rivieras coming into the dealership, seeing that 86 Riviera and saying, oh gosh, that's exactly what I wanted as my next car. And I think it just alienated the customer base. In fact, that 1986 Riviera just sold so horribly, I think around 20,000 units thereabout, whereas these vehicles were selling 50,000 units plus. It just was an absolute bomb. And it's unfortunate because they just required a completely different customer base, and dealers, I don't think, knew how to sell it. I also think that GM proved so successful in downsizing their Tornado and their Eldorado, as well as the Riviera, for the 79 to 85 generation versus the previous generation models, that they got a bit overconfident with the downsizing and thought that customers were just going to keep buying more and more downsized cars. And it didn't help that by 1986, fuel prices were low again, and gasoline, I believe, was under $1 a gallon at that point, and people wanted big cars again. Those cars, the 86 Riviera and Tornado and Eldorado, were planned back in the early 80s at a time when it was thought that gasoline was going to be extremely expensive, and that just didn't turn out to be the case by the time they were launched. And so they really had a hard time in the marketplace. And they also look similar to the end cars, the Olds Calais, the Buick Somerset that came out before the Riviera, as well as the Tornado. So I just think that they had a rough go of it. In any case, drop a comment in the comment section for what you think of this 1982 Buick Riviera, which again is on Bring a Trailer. So take a look at it there. Thanks again for watching.